Well, hello, and welcome back to our Bible study time. We have been talking about there can be only one. We've been taking our text from the book of Galatians, chapter 1. So the subtitle today is A Desert Meeting. A Desert Meeting. Galatians chapter 1, verses 17 through 20. I want you to just take a moment and come with me to the theater, that we might see the stage that God is preparing for Paul's training. If we just kind of glance at the stage without really investigating it, we're going to miss the most important parts of the trapping. So let's take a real good look and look behind the curtain, and let's see what we can see about and learn about how God prepares the stage and trains his leaders. Now, let me make an observation here real quick, because this is important. Leaders are made. They're not born. You've heard a lot of people say, well, leaders are born. Leaders are not born. Leaders may be born with the necessary ingredients to make them a leader, but they have to be made. They have to be developed. So leaders are not born. Leaders are made. Let me read to you from the New Language Translation, and I'm going to read verses 17 through 20 this morning. So here's what it says. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to consult with those who were apostles before I was. Instead, I went away into Arabia, and later I returned to the city of Damascus. Then 3 years later, I went to Jerusalem to get to know Peter, and I stayed with him for 15 days. The only other apostle I met at that time was James, the Lord's brother. I declare before God that what I am writing to you is not a lie. And so the first thing I want you to notice is that Paul, just probably good to say this, Paul is defending his apostolic authority. He's defending his apostolic position. And let me just say it to you like this, that if you don't trust the chef, you're not going to want to eat their cooking. And so it's necessary, it's important that Paul defends his authority, his position as an apostle, and it's important that he gets them to believe. So the first thing that Paul tells us in verse 17, he says, nor did I go to Jerusalem after my conversion, I'm paraphrasing, to consult with those who were apostles before I was. Instead, I went to Arabia. And then later, I returned to the city of Damascus. So the first thing I want you to notice is that there's obscurity here. There's lessons to be learned when God puts you off into a place of obscurity, a place by yourself. Now, the Arabia is a desert place. And so I've said this to you before, but I want to say it again because perhaps you didn't catch some of the other parts of this particular series. Everybody goes to the desert. Moses went to the desert. Paul went to the desert. Joseph went to the desert. David had a desert experience. Maybe they weren't specifically in a desert, but we all have that period of time when we're alone with God. Paul needed some things. God is preparing the stage in Paul's life. So let me just regress a little bit and say this to you. The first thing I want to do this morning is talk to you about Paul. And then we're going to extrapolate from Paul's life some things that God is going to do and is doing in your life and in my life. So the first thing I want you to see here from verse 17 is that Paul had an independent spirit. Paul had an independent spirit, and God needed to address that issue. Paul needed to be broken. God needed to address that issue. There's a time of training. We have a cliche down south where I come from. Some were called, some were sent, some just got up and went. And you don't want to be one of those people that just got up and went, and when you got there, you realize that you didn't have a clue what to do. You didn't have the message. You didn't know how to prepare a message. You didn't have anything. You know what? Let me say this to you. Be a Christian first. Don't be a preacher. Don't be an evangelist. Don't be an apostle. Just be a Christian. Let God work his character into your life. I complained to God many years ago about this drug dealer who was driving a brand new Lincoln. And this was, during the day when there were Lincolns. This was 40 plus years ago. This big old thing, and he had a burnt orange roof on it, and his boots were matching that. And I complained to God. And I said to God, this guy's not serving you. He's driving a new car, and I'm walking. And God didn't say anything. Years later, God kind of dropped the truth in my heart. Something like 30 years later. And that truth was this: Abe, I can give you a car. I can give you cars and clothes and diamond rings, but I can't give you character. Friend, God is endeavoring to work character into Paul's life right now. There's a time to wait on God. There's a time, I said, to wait on God. Paul has a prideful attitude. He needed an attitude adjustment. And God is about to make that adjustment. He sends Paul into Arabia, the desert. And I'm going to guess that Paul, probably has some friends. But I want you to just be mindful of the fact that Paul had been excommunicated from his, not from being a Pharisee, but Paul had been excommunicated from his entire community. He was alone. You say, well, the Christians embraced him. No, they didn't, because Paul had a reputation of killing people, and especially the church. And so Paul was not embraced by Christians. Paul has had a radical change, and he needed time to digest that. He needed time to assimilate, to absorb what has happened in his life. Paul needed time to consider the ramifications of what had transpired in his life, and he needed time to consider the consequences of his future actions. If he indeed ran with Christ, then there would be a price to pay. Paul needed time to be alone with God. Moses, I said to you earlier, needed that time. Elijah needed that time. Paul needed that time. Verses 18 and 19. Then Paul says, then 3 years later, I went to Jerusalem to get to know Peter, and I stayed with him for 15 days. Verse 19 says, the only other apostle I met at that time was James, the Lord's brother. Now we need to ask ourselves a question. Why did Paul go to see Peter? Let me share with you what I believe is going on here. I think, first of all, out of respect for the authority that God had given Peter. Paul is saying to them, I'm not a renegade. I'm not your enemy. I'm a Christian. I'm not in pursuit of you to kill you. And I want you to know that I respect what God has done, is doing, and is going to do through your life, Peter, you and the other apostles. Now, he did not go. I want to make this clear to you. Paul did not go to place himself under their authority, but to say to them, again, I'm not a renegade. I'm no longer your enemy, and I respect what God is doing through you and in you. I respect that. Here is what God is doing in my life, Paul says. You need to know what God is doing in my life. You need to know that God has called me, that God spoke to me. I'm gonna imagine that they sit down on the couch, and let's just say that it was winter, the fireplace was going, and they I'm a coffee drinker, so they sat there with a good cup of coffee, and they talked about this radical change that had taken place in Paul's life. Paul needed them to know, I respect what God is doing through you, but I want you to respect what God is doing through me. I made a comment to my kids, and I made a comment to others, and I want to make the comment to you. Respect is earned. Respect is earned. It's not given. No one owes you respect. Well, they owe me respect. It's my kid. Let me tell you something. They may love you, but they may not respect you. Respect is earned. I know my children love me. I'm their father. But I've had to earn their respect. And so Paul says to them, listen, guys, I respect you, but you need to respect me. Verse 20 says, and I've gleaned from verse 20, item 3 on my list. God is glorified. So Paul says, I declare before God that what I am writing to you is not a lie. Now, the things which I'm writing, Paul says, they're not a lie. Before God, the word before is an important word. It means in the presence of God. The statement refers to primarily verses 18 and 19. But Paul says, I want you to understand that as I stand before God, God is my witness that I'm not lying to you guys. I'm telling you the truth. No matter what my adversaries, the Judaizers, may be saying about me, about the gospel that I'm preaching, I want you to know that what I'm saying, God is my witness. He said, I went to see Peter. I saw only Peter and James, saw none of the other apostles. He says, I want you to know that. He said, I only stayed there 15 days. He said, these are the facts. These are the facts. And they were so important that Paul defends his apostolic independence that he adds to that comment before God. God had done something in Paul's life, and God was about to do something through Paul's life. Let's talk a little bit about you and I, just for a moment. We can see God's actions in Paul's life. Can we see God's actions in your life and in my life? I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to stop for a moment and take inventory of your life and ask yourself, God, what are you doing in my life? What do you want to do in my life? Jesus said, be ye therefore perfect, Matthew 5:48. The word means to be whole. God says, I want to make you whole. I realize you've been broken by sin. You've been broken by Satan. You've been broken by this evil world you live in. He says, I want to fix you. My oldest son is into old cars. He likes to buy them and fix them up. All right. And God says, I want to fix you. And so we can see God in action in Paul's life. God has set the stage. He has prepared this theater, so to speak, that he might produce his character in this man called Paul. But God has also set a stage for your life and for my life that he would like to use to develop his character in your life and in my life. Let me say this to you. Paul the apostle, I think we all agree, was the greatest apostle of them all. However, Paul the apostle is gone. But God is still here. And God would like to use you. He'd like to work his character in your life. Number two, God needed time along with Paul. You know, beloved, God needs time alone with you and I. Do you spend that time with God? Do you set aside a time, excuse me, when you're fasting and praying and you push away the TV and you push away friends and you say, I'm going to spend this time with God? When I'm doing my prayer time is in the mornings. I don't like to be interrupted. Let me tell you why. It's not that God can't handle an interruption, but the reason I don't like to be interrupted is because I find it rude to God. If you and I were talking, someone just came in and began to talk, that would be rude. And so you need time alone with God so that God can just talk to you about you, not about world events, not about what he's going to do to your enemy down the street. God just needs time to talk to you about you. We need to be careful when we say we're going to set aside a time. And I'm not saying you have to do that every month, but you should do it at least once or twice a year where you set aside this time. If you're working, take some vacation time and set aside that time with God. There was a time for God to prepare Paul, and God needs a time to prepare you for the challenges that lay ahead. I went in the Army in 1967, July. In December of 1967, I was in Vietnam. And when I was in basic training, I really didn't appreciate the drill sergeants and what they were endeavoring to do in my life. However, when I got to Vietnam, I appreciated what they had done and how they had prepared me mentally and emotionally and physically for what I was about to face, the challenges that lay ahead. You don't know what tomorrow holds for you. I don't know what tomorrow holds for me, but I know that God knows. And God says, I want to prepare you. Let me work in your life. Let me check your armor. You know, when a paratrooper's getting ready to jump out the plane, before they get off the ground, they check their equipment. God says, let me make sure that you've got on the whole armor. Let me make sure that your equipment is just right. And so you're saying to God, you're saying to yourself, God, I don't understand what you're doing in my life. It's a little uncomfortable. He's just checking your equipment. He's preparing you for the challenge that lies ahead. Paul's theological foundation had been blown away on the road to Damascus. And you and I, who did not grow up in this thing, I grew up in a religious organization, you know, as sincere as they might have been, they were as wrong as the day is long. And when I got saved, actually, let me back up a little bit. I came home out of the Army, and my mom and my oldest brother had gotten saved. And then I was a little offended because they had left this religious organization. But I want you to know that one night, some 3 years later, I gave my life to Jesus Christ. It blew away my entire theological foundation. I needed to sit and absorb and contemplate and digest what God had done in my life. And I know that you need to do the same. You need to sit and be still and allow yourself to come to an understanding of what has happened on your road to Damascus. God needed time to rebuild Paul's life. God needs time to rebuild your theological foundation. Will you give God that time? In this portion of Scripture, I can sense the hardship that Paul had faced. I'm sure that there was deep pain from the loss of friend and family. But yet Paul had made a decision. Perhaps in your life today, perhaps your decision for Christ has caused some of your friends, maybe some of your relatives, to get up and walk away from you. But I want you to know you've made the right decision. And I want to encourage you to be still and allow God to work in your life. I promise you, you're going to like it. Your gift, my friend, your gift will make room for you. Until next time, may God bless you and keep you, and thank you for watching this YouTube broadcast, and be sure and tell someone about it. Thanks again. God